Hello students, welcome to today's session. Usually, students prepare for exam just for the sake of writing the exam. They never analyze the quality of answers, where do they commit silly mistakes and lose marks, what does the board expect from you. Students never consider all these aspects. They just do hard work without any smart work. As a result, a great deal of time is lost and they lose mark also. In today's session, we will focus on the common mistakes made by students and the answer tips along with examiners' comments. Please watch the video till the end so that you can perform well in the exam. So what we are going to do is, we will pick up a couple of important previous year's board questions and analyze those questions from the examiner's point of view very critically, and will give you the suggestions and feedbacks and tips for improving the quality of answers. Okay, the first question is, name the factors affecting the turning effect of a body. You have to mention the factor. Let us go into the video. So what are the factors affecting the turning effect of a body? I have written the answers correctly here. Turning effect of the force depends on two factors. First of all, the magnitude of force applied and the perpendicular distance of the line of action of force from the axis of rotation. You know it, the torque or the turning effect is equal to force into perpendicular distance. This is the formula. Okay, and this is the correct way of writing the answer. And what are the examiner's comments? Most of the students, most of the candidates, they write the answers correctly, but many a time they overlook the importance of mentioning the perpendicular distance of the line of action of force from the axis of rotation. So they overlook this factor, the perpendicular distance. They just write perpendicular distance. Perpendicular distance from where? From the line of action of the force or from the axis of rotation. That should be exactly mentioned. Otherwise, you will lose mark. Alright? So what are the answering tips? So you study the factors, but you do some kind of incomplete study. Alright? Students should read the question carefully and understand exactly what is expected as an answer. So physics purely a logical subject. The answer should be crisp and meaningful and up to the points. Then only full mark will be awarded. Alright? Okay. Now question number 2. A force is applied on a non-rigid body and a rigid body. How does the effect of force differ in the above two cases? It's a 2-mark questions. Let's go directly into the analysis. A force is applied on a non-rigid body. You know, a non-rigid body is very soft. So when you apply force, its dimension changes. Length, breadth, area, volume changes, right? Its dimension changes in case of a non-rigid body. But what about rigid body? How does a force affect rigid body? No change in the dimension. So this is the correct way of answering the question. So force brings about change in the dimension in case of a non-rigid body, and there is no change in dimension in case of a rigid body, because rigid body being very strong. Alright. So what are the examiners' comment here? So many of the candidates, they write the correct answer, but however they lack a conviction about the difference in the effect of force on this body. They do not have a proper conviction. In many cases, they either write the change in case of rigid body or in case of non-rigid body. They don't make any differences here. They don't mention any differences here. So the most of the students were not able to write the correct difference in both cases. So these are the examiner's comments. So what are the tips for this writing this answer? First of all, the difference between a rigid body and non-rigid body with example should be studied. You should study the difference between a rigid body and a non-rigid body. Develop a habit of explaining concepts by drawing diagram wherever it is possible. Okay, diagrammatic representation of forces needs to be emphasized. So in physics, wherever it is possible, draw the diagram. So in case of a non-rigid body, I can say, so in case of a non-rigid body, by application of force changes the dimension. So in case of non-rigid. Alright, so in case of rigid body, by the application of force, no change in dimension. So you can draw the diagram and explain. So explanation through the diagram will be more clear. Now question number 3. On what factors does the position of center of gravity of a body depend? This is a 1 mark questions. Okay, let us see how the answers are written and how the analysis is done. So what are the factors on which center of gravity of a body depend? The correct answer I have written here. Depends on shape of the body or distribution of mass of the body. This is the correct answer. So center of gravity depends on the shape of the body or the distribution of mass of the body. When the body is deformed, the center of gravity changes, which is very well explained in my previous backup videos. Please watch the video and understand. So what are the examiners comment here? Many students, they fail to understand what is center of gravity and they mention the answers incorrectly. The factors stated are it with the size or volume or mass of the body. So many students stated incorrect factors such as size and volume. Alright. So you should be able to understand what is center of gravity and on what factors does it depend. The tips for the students should be able to understand what is center of gravity and by taking many examples. You should study the case of many examples so that all the students can understand that even bodies of the same volume or same mass can still have the different position of center of gravity. Alright. So this is the answering tips. You must understand what is center of gravity exactly, what is center of gravity, on what point does it depend. Focus on this answering tips. Okay. Now moving on to the 4th question. Calculate the change in kinetic energy of a moving body if its velocity is reduced to 1/3 of the initial velocity. It's also a 1 mark question. Let us see how it is solved and analyzed. So I have solved the question on the whiteboard. You can see the initial kinetic energy is equal to half mv square. V1 let it be 1 and the final kinetic energy half m into 1/3 v the whole square. That is V2 changes. The final velocity changes to 1/3 of the initial velocity. And putting the value in the equation, you can see KE1 ratio KE2 is equal to half m into 1 square ratio 1/2 m into 1/3 the whole square. So 1/2 m 1/2 m get cancelled. We are getting it as 1 ratio 1/9. That is equal to 9 ratio 1. So this is the correct answer. Okay, 9 ratio 1. So this is the change in kinetic energy. So what are the examiners' comments over this question? So here many of the candidates got confused whether to write the change in kinetic energy, changed kinetic energy, or to write the difference between final kinetic energy and initial kinetic energy. So students were not able to comprehend the question very properly, whether to write the change in kinetic energy or to write the difference between final kinetic energy and the initial kinetic energy. Some candidates, what they did, they squared the velocity after finding the difference between final and initial velocity. They just squared the velocity rather than subtracting them after taking their squares. You have to after subtracting, you have to take the square. Instead of some candidates square the velocity after finding the difference between final and initial velocity. So that is the wrong method. Alright. So these are the examiners' comments and observation. So what are the tips? So you must learn what is kinetic energy, the formula for kinetic energy, and what are the factors on which kinetic energy depends. Okay. So mass and velocity. So how the kinetic energy get affected by changing the mass and velocity. So when you get the formula, you have to analyze each formula very critically. Alright. Okay. Now let us go to the 5th question. What is the principle of an ideal machine? A very simple question. All of you may be knowing the answer. Let's go to the analysis. It's a 1 mark question. All of you know the answer. Principle of an ideal machine. Ideal machine, not the actual machine. Work output is equal to work input. Alright. In case of actual machine, this is not applicable. So it's a 1 mark question. Let us go to the analysis. What are the comments given by the examiners? Most of the candidates write the answers very correctly, but many of the candidates are confused with the principle of ideal machine and the principle of moments. So students were not able to write the correct answer exactly because they were confused between the principle of ideal machine and the principle of moments. The principle of moment is different. Principle of moment states that sum of the clockwise moment is equal to sum of the anti-clockwise moment when the lever is in equilibrium. So learn these concepts very thoroughly. So what are the tips? So you should be able to differentiate between what is principle of moments and what is principle of an ideal machine. The applications of both concepts are different. Okay. Moving on to the last question of this session, sixth question. With reference to the term mechanical advantage, velocity ratio and efficiency of a machine, name and define the term that will not change for a machine of a given design. We have to name and define the term. Okay, let's go to the analysis directly. So for a machine, which term doesn't change? Mechanical advantage, velocity ratio or efficiency? Of course, the answer is velocity ratio. So velocity ratio of a machine of particular design is constant. It will never change. And the second answer is name and define. Read the question thoroughly. And second part is you have to define what is velocity ratio. So velocity ratio is the ratio of velocity of effort to the velocity of load. Okay, that is the definition of velocity ratio. So 1 mark here, 1 mark here for the correct answers. So what happened? What is the examiner's comments? Majority of the candidates failed to comprehend this question. Majority of the candidates, they could not understand this question. They wrote the definition of mechanical advantage, velocity ratio and efficiency without mentioning velocity ratio does not change. Okay, so they did not mention the velocity ratio does not change, and they just define mechanical advantage, efficiency and velocity ratio. And even some of the students, they also wrote the definition of velocity ratio in terms of displacements without using this displacement in the same time. Actually, how can you define velocity ratio in terms of displacement? Velocity ratio is the ratio of displacement of effort to the displacement of load in the same time. In same time, you have to mention in same time. If you are giving the definition of velocity ratio in terms of displacement of effort and displacement of the load, should be mentioned in same time. All right. So these are the observations by the examiners. So the tips to the student is that explain how velocity ratio is same as in spite of varying mechanical advantage and efficiency of the same machine through numerous examples. You must understand how velocity ratio remains unaffected, but mechanical advantage and efficiency may change. Efficiency depends upon the friction or the weight of the lower block of the pulley, etc. So, but velocity ratio remains unaffected. So, you have to read many examples and you have to comprehend all these facts. I hope this session was very useful to you. Okay, thank you very much for watching.